Thank you, Andy. Man, it's so good to see. I mean, I'm thinking like Eric Stilling and like Steven. I mean, people who I haven't seen in years. So it's really good to see y'all. And others, I talk to Maria somewhat often, and Meg and a few others. So thank y'all for being here. So my name is Geoff Burkhart. For those of you that I don't know, I'm the executive director of the Texas Indigent Defense Commission. So TIDC, we've been around about 20 years now, and we basically do three things. We don't do any direct representation, but we do fund, oversee, and work to improve public defense in Texas. So that includes funding all 254 counties, at least a sliver of their budgets. We fund 6 innocence projects. This is not 6, by the way. Sorry, I'm talking to research. This is 6. Sorry, 6 innocence projects. We put money into new public defender offices. We help plan new public defender offices. We also suck up a bunch of data from all 254 counties in Texas, and I'll show you our website in a moment. Hopefully this summer or this fall, we'll be in a position to hire a full-time researcher. That's our hope, at least. I'm hemming and hawing a little bit because I won't know until after we're out of the ledge session for sure. But we think there's a pretty decent chance that we'll be able to do that. And if we can do that, we'd really like to kind of hit the ground running. And that's why I wanted to come to IDRA and ask you all what you think this position should look like. So I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about TIDC and the things that kind of drove us to the idea that we might want a researcher on board. And then Andy has very kindly offered to help lead the conversation and pick y'all's brains about what this position could look like. So for the past 20 years, we've not had a researcher. We have partnered with Texas A&M's Public Policy Research Institute. So several of you may know Dottie Carmichael or George Nafal or Heather Kaspers, who we've worked with for years and we hope to continue to work with. They've been fantastic. But we've amassed kind of a small mountain of data at this point. A few different things that kind of occurred to a few of us on staff. I think one is that could we be wielding and crunching this data in some more beneficial way? Because we don't have a researcher in-house. Somebody who's really kind of thinking about that. The other thoughts that we had, the data website that I'm about to show you in a moment, it's good. I mean, I think we collected some great information, but there are just a ton of ways we can improve it. And we're talking very seriously about ways that we might want to transition to a new data website. And having somebody on board to help maybe think about that, we think would be beneficial. Also, we commission a lot of studies, but it's very ad hoc, right? We do a study over there, we do one over here. There really is no kind of research agenda or anything like that. It's kind of what people apply for and what strikes us as kind of interesting in the moment. And lastly, other things about, what data could we be presenting to the legislature or our board, things like that. I take it back. I'm going to add just one other thing that we've been thinking about. I mentioned we build a lot of public defender offices, and in fact, we added 10 more counties last year. We aren't always sending money out the door with a hitch to it, which I think we should be. And that hitch should be that we're actually evaluating that office as we're creating it, and that we're getting information back that this office is working or it's not, or better yet, that we can maybe even know why it's working, right? So those are some of the things that kind of drove us to the thought that maybe we want a researcher in-house. I don't think that takes the place of Texas A&M. I think we'll continue to want to work with outside researchers, but we think there could be some great benefit to having a researcher on board. That's what we think, at least. And you all can tell us if you're crazy, you don't need a researcher on board, or yeah, you do need one on board, and here's why, and it's not for the reasons you think. But as we think about this and think about drafting a kind of a job solicitation, and we think about what the job description would be, what the person would actually do, that, oh my gosh, a researcher could do 40 different things here. What's the most important, and what should we outsource? So that's my kind of spiel about TIDC. Let me just briefly show you our data website. I think some of you have probably seen this before. Okay, can you all see that? All right, good. So, basically down here on the right, you can scroll down and pick a county. Let's see, I'll just pick, I don't know, it didn't really matter too much. I'll pick, Limestone County, right? And it tells us the population, tells us the overall defense costs, $294,000. For some reason, it's saying $0 in formula. I'm going to pick a different county because I don't think that's right. So Leon County, population 17,000, indigent defense costs. Here's formula grant, which is our kind of just, we're reimbursing on average about 10% for most counties. Improvement grants, this is what we usually use for either building a new public defender office, adding a managed assigned counsel system, or sometimes just adding a position or working on a little pilot program, things like that. If I click down here on data sheet, we get a lot of more information. And of course it's being slow, but maybe that illustrates my point in the need for a new data website. But here you get a little bit more information, right? You can see Texas in this first column. And then you see Leon County for the past several years, 2019 going back to 2015. We can tell you things like what their appointment rate is in the county for felonies. We can tell you what the appointment rate is for misdemeanors. We can tell you the number of cases disposed. We can tell you, and this is one that I love, total indigent defense expenditure per population. You know, Sixth Amendment Center tells us that the average per capita expenditure is about $17 per capita. Texas, you can see, is about 10, and Leon County is just 7. So it's not spending quite that much. One other just real quick corner that I want to show you, we did, thankfully working with the ABA and with NLADA, we started this thing called Act Smart. And this, it never came out to what we really wanted it to be, but I think it's maybe a hint of what the future of our data collection and data, I think data communication and visualization could maybe look like. And again, you can see it taking a little bit of time to load here. Here we go. So this is using a lot of that same data, it's just crunching it differently. So at the top, I can choose a county. In fact, I can choose a couple of them, and I can choose different years, and it'll give me some answers to questions about appointment rates and things like that. But what I really like is that if you click on this little eye, it tells you what the measure is, it tells you what the formula for the measure is, and it gives you links to statutes and standards and additional resources related to that measure. So anyway, a little bit of a taste of where we might want to go with this. So that's, I think, TIDC in a nutshell. I think hopefully you have a sense of what is making us think that perhaps we want a researcher on board when we haven't had one for 20 years. Andy, what else, or Andy or Meg or Stephen, I mean, what else would be helpful before we open it up to conversation?
You mentioned that one reason you're looking at a possible hire is you might want that website to work better, and that seems pretty distinct from what a researcher might do. So you can talk a little bit more about what you've envisioned. And I know this is related to your question of who should you hire, right? Because then maybe you're not actually right. So if you could elaborate a little on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So Andy and I were just talking about this yesterday, actually. Yeah, we're certainly not looking for somebody who's a web developer. That's something that I think we would want to contract with somebody. But I guess what I mean by that is somebody who could maybe help us think through, here are the metrics that we currently collect. Are there additional metrics that we should be really looking at? And I don't want to simplify too much. I mean, we'd have to bring them to our board, and that could be an uphill battle. I mean, there are obstacles there. But what other metrics could we be looking at? And also, input from a researcher on how could we slice and dice some of this stuff to get some more usable and interesting information. So we certainly don't want a web developer. We don't want a graphic designer or a user experience person. I think we'd kind of contract with people to do that sort of work. But I think we probably, my hunch is we'd benefit from a researcher's input on that project.
So I'm going to say what I said to Andy and Stephen when we started talking about this, which is Leslie, I'm going to make Leslie talk. No, Leslie gave a really interesting talk about this at our ASC replacement conference, where she talked about sort of two different kind of researcher. I mean, she talked about a lot of other stuff, but in some sense, like there's different types of research, right? Like different levels of research that she talked about. And I don't know if you two have talked about that, but sort of thinking about like differences between like summarizing data, visualizing data, things like that, and longer research projects, like the sort of year-long research projects or things like that. I don't know if Leslie wants to talk about that, or if you've thought about that, Geoff, in terms of sort of what, Like, are we trying to figure out what is happening? Or are we trying to think about like why it's happening, things like that?
Yeah, we talked to, and actually Leslie and I have a call. I don't think we set a date and time yet, but we are going to talk in the next couple of weeks. I spoke with Jonah, who I think's on this call, and spoke a little bit with Torrin in Indiana. And Andy and I have talked about it a little bit. I guess the way that there's probably a better way to think of it than this. But the way that I kind of have been thinking about it is almost like a spectrum. Folks on the one far side who are pure number crunchers, right? You give them a data set and they're really going to dive into that and they can get us something really interesting. And on the far other side, maybe somebody who is, a researcher, maybe has that background, but is tending more toward like the strategic side and almost like an MBA kind of person and thinking about how to visualize and communicate that sort of data and things like that. And I think that's part of the thing I would like to hear from this group is what would be, from what you know of TIDC, what would be most helpful. I have my thoughts on it, and I think some of our staff members do too. But I don't know that I'm really married to any one vision of this, right? We're in a place where we can continue to outsource a lot of the kind of research projects, and we don't expect one person to run all the research projects we're doing. But some of the big needs, like I identified earlier, I mean, I think, yeah, we have this small mountain of data. What the heck does it mean, right? We don't have somebody who full-time is just kind of really deeply familiar. I mean, we have, thanks to, Jesse Tyler and George Nafal and other folks in Texas, we do have some people who are pretty familiar with the data set, but not anybody who's really looking at that full-time. We don't really have anybody who's thinking about, all right, out of all this data that we have, what's really most persuasive? I think working with our policy team and working with me, what's most persuasive to our board and to the legislature to show how bad things are in some ways in terms of indigent defense? How do we show improvement, right? How do we, as I mentioned before, like if we're funding all these new public defender offices, which is great, but what does it mean? And how do we demonstrate improvement? Can we actually concretely show that this has made a difference, right? So I know that's probably like a bunch of different areas, and maybe the person who can do that is a unicorn and doesn't exist. So out of those areas, where do we concentrate? And I don't know that I know the answer to that as I sit here.
Well, I would say that IDRA is an organization devoted to unicorns. It's not in our statement of purpose, but I really mean it may as well be. We are segueing logically into your first question here, Geoff, which is what ideally does the lead researcher for a statewide commission do? I think that you're highlighting several different possibilities. Stephen immediately pointed out the website part of this. You're also asking kind of conceptual questions about which things to measure and why. You then almost have what seems to me is a deeper question of, we have this data, what does it mean? I want to also highlight a question that Daniel Saroff, I apologize if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, put in the chat. And I think the question is addressed to you, Geoff. It says, the data is interesting, but how do you use it and how does it drive decisions? It seems to me that is kind of knit into the question that you're also asking to us of what do the data mean and how should we use it? So I don't know if you have a response to that, but I just wanted to put it into the conversation. And meanwhile, I see also that perhaps Eric Stilling has a comment.
Sure.
It's good to see you, by the way, Joe. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Good to see you, Eric.
I'm not entirely clear what data you are currently collecting, but one of the things that we've had to do, we have a database and Defender data software, just scores and scores of fields, and we can't make them all mandatory because it take more time than sadly than some of the cases take to bring to disposition. But what we looked at was, what is our immediate problems? And we definitely have to make sure we collect those data. And of course, it was all about funding and money and caseloads. So we collected that data. Now there's further down the road, we're going to want to demonstrate, if we ever get properly funded, we're going to want to demonstrate improvements, outcomes. So even though that's not on our immediate research agenda, we know we want to start collecting that because we'd like a long history of data to look at, particularly when you're looking at change. You want a before and an after, right? So we try to make sure to keep an eye to the next questions we think we're going to be required to answer. And sometimes questions are going to pop up unexpectedly that you wish you had the data for. And I've been pushing to get, for example, I've been pushing to get the bail amounts, which with great pushback from the lawyers in the field. But as it turns out, there's a federal suit in New Orleans where they said judges can't impose money bail as a, greatly over paraphrasing. I mean, oversimplifying. You can no longer impose a dollar amount because the judges get part of that money. So now we really wish we had collected all those data. So there are things that are going to pop up that you need to remain nimble for, as well as kind of predicting 2 years out, we're going to need to answer this question, although maybe not now. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we just, part of it is we don't know what's coming down the pike, and some of it I think we can probably guess at, and some of it maybe we don't know for sure. And to have somebody who's really kind of nimble like that and can respond to that would be fantastic. I mean, I think tying it into, that earlier question, Andy, I'm just looking at the chat. From Daniel, my question is, the data is interesting, but how do you use it? How does it drive decisions? Right now I can tell you how we use it, and I think there may be maybe part of my question is like, what other ways should we be using it, right? But I can tell you how we use it now. We get several different ways. I think one is that we get calls very often from reporters, at least a weekly basis, usually a couple a week or 2-3 a week, asking about how much is spent in a certain county, or what appointment rates are like, or is this county kind of normal compared to other Texas counties. We get calls from researchers all the time who want to use our data set. I mean, several of you are good examples of this, who have used this data set is all public. It's all available to the public. Who use that on a pretty regular basis. We use it. I'll give you another example. I mean, today, right before this call, I had a call from 2 judges looking to build a public defender office. And I was able to pull up the 3 or 4 counties they were talking about pretty quickly and say, well, population in these counties is X, and it looks like the indigent defense expenditures are Y. And I can tell you that, the per capita expenditure in this area seems a little bit low to me, much lower than the average statewide, and certainly much lower than it is nationally. And so a lot of that we use in kind of figuring out how to build new public defender offices and things like that. But then we also use it with our legislature. I mean, we're able to say, we're going to the legislature right now, and we're able to say, look, over half of Texas counties reported $0 in investigative expenditure last year. $0. That means in literally every case in that county, they're not reporting any money for any kind of investigative work, regardless of what the duty is to investigate, right? Things like that. Or we can show how many people receive counsel in misdemeanor cases across the state and say, look, we have a lot of folks who are uncounseled. Here's what that looks like. So those are some of the uses right now. Andy, I don't know if you want me to go to some more of the questions in the chat, or if you want to, I can just hand it back to you to moderate it. I'm happy to do whatever you want.
This is Daniel. Can I elaborate? Sure. Would you mind if I elaborated on my question? And sure. I'm sorry, I don't have my video on because I was just exercising, so I don't look pretty. I'm the CIO for the Massachusetts Public Defenders. So the reason I ask is we're also in the process of examining the utility of getting a data analyst versus what we currently do, go to local colleges and universities to get data science assistance. And I guess one of the key challenges we face is there's lots of data out there, and people frequently start with the data, and I think that's sort of the wrong end of the hourglass. The hourglass, the spyglass is really, what are the questions you're trying to drive towards? So for example, we want to look to see if there's systemic bias in counties and in courts against certain types of our clients based on race and ethnicity. And that actually will then drive for us potentially what we want to look in a data analyst, because we want to be able to visualize it so we could present this to the legislature and to the press in a simple fashion. And we also want to do some fairly complex analytics versus another instance where they switched from in-person bail reduction hearings to video-based bail reduction hearings. We wanted to analyze whether or not that had an impact, i.e. would the bail reductions changed based on in-person and video. By the way, you'll find we found that if you do video bail reduction hearings, people get smaller reductions they would have otherwise. So that's why I asked, because you have a lot of data out there, but from us, and what I'm trying to drive for, even though I'm on the technical side of the spectrum, is what are the questions we think are critical to answer? What are the key constituencies we want to look at? And then that actually will help us drive toward the type of data analyst or the analytics, or even the skill sets. Do you need somebody who's graphically capable, because you need to present this information to people who cannot understand standard deviations and p-values and things of that general nature? So
right.
I'm asking both selfishly for myself, but also for you. I think those are key things to figure out when you're looking at a data analyst.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, that's one thing just to emphasize. I mean, I mean, some people are interested in just crunching numbers and for the sake of crunching numbers, and it seems interesting. I'm not personally interested in that, but also I don't think we have time for that. You know, if we're going to, I mean, some of the things we collect are mandated by statute, so there's certain kind of metrics that we don't have a choice. We're going to collect that no matter what. But as we think about what else we want to collect, if anything, Daniel, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we should be answering some of the, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of questions we have about indigent defense that we can't answer right now for Texas, right? We don't have case level data, right? We have system level data. There's a lot of stuff that we can't answer, and I think that should absolutely drive this. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that kind of gets to what you're thinking about, but
yeah, Geoff, there's other things in the chat, so I feel like I'm like shoving in my thing in the chat. And Jesse talks about, you know, thinking about like how you can expand your data. But I also really, I mean, you have a very strong team in terms of policy and understanding indigent defense in Texas, and sort of qualitative research, even I would say, like going into courts and really understanding that. So I would just sort of urge you to think about where, like for me, it seems like, and I may be wrong from the outside, but that like one of your holes is really more of the quantitative aspects, right? Like, yeah. I feel like your team can really explain like how things work very well. And so obviously it'd be really nice to have somebody who likes to do data for policy, but I think that having somebody who likes to do research but isn't quite as strong in the data might not serve you as well. So thinking, but just because of how your team, I mean, you have a lot of people who do what we kind of think of as research, but they're not data necessarily, primarily data people, right? And so, so that I would just urge you to sort of think about that, how that fits in with your team.
I think that's, oh, go ahead, Andy, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I actually don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation too much. I just wanted to highlight a few of the themes that we're hearing. I appreciate the sort of magnetic nature of thinking about the what metrics it is that we want to collect, but also really appreciate the redirection from Daniel to sort of think about questions and also think about skill sets and general orientation. I particularly heard from Daniel the thought about what is your audience here. Clearly, Geoff, you receive questions from many different people, so you have a lot of different audiences, and but that is worth thinking about, because it sort of does determine, you know, what it is that you actually aim to produce and what it is that you want to prioritize. Depends a little bit on who you're trying to appeal to, and, you know, therefore with what you will actually appeal to them. I also really wanted to reiterate or kind of just try to tread the same fine line that Meg is trying to tread in describing somebody who does research and policy. I think that and policy part is really critically important, because as much as you have incredibly knowledgeable staff, and as much as you have people who are actually more expert in the political and strategic and just simple policy background of all of this than, in a sense, any of us could become without also spending 20 years at it. If you can find somebody who has worked as a researcher for, let's say, a couple of years of experience in some policy context, some place where they had to take their skills and apply them to questions that were important to audiences for some strategic goal, I think that experience is very, very important and kind of form and does distinguish a person from somebody who's simply gone through, an economics program or something like that and knows how to handle their statistics. As much as Meg is also right that those kinds of technical skills are super duper valuable, but having that sort of policy context and having somebody who can think about data in terms of how can I appeal to an audience, how can I answer a question, and also, and this is if you're really, if you're really lucky and things are working in a really complementary way, a data analyst who can look at the data and say, I can see a way to use this to answer a question that nobody else might have seen before.
Yeah. I think you all have hit on, Meg, thanks. I think you're right. We've been lucky, very lucky with our staff and our hiring. You see several of the folks here. We've got a pretty deep bench. Wesley's been with us for 20 years. Scott's been with us for several years. We've, in recent years, a few of you probably know Kathleen Casey-Gomez and Claire Buteau. We've been really fortunate to have people who know policy really well. And there is this, and maybe it's a false dichotomy, but maybe a little bit of a tension between, I'll call it the Burkhart-Ehlers or the Ehlers-Burkhart kind of tension. I think Scott's point in a lot of our conversations internally is, we got the policy in. We know people who know the legislature. They know how to work with county officials. We know the laws regarding indigent defense inside and out. We really need a number cruncher. And I think I've kind of said yes, and it'd be good to have somebody who has a little bit of the policy background and kind of, we can put in front of our board members, right? We can, and can think strategically a little bit. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's something we've definitely talked a lot about and thought a lot about.
So I just want to point out that several people on this call did not start out as indigent defense researchers when they got to indigent defense.
Yeah.
So I would say yes, a caring about it is important, but I do feel like there is a fair amount of flexibility given that. I think what Jonah said in his chat about critical to find someone who has the ability to translate research concepts and findings to non-researchers, right. That is critical, but that doesn't have to be necessarily an indigent defense researcher or even necessarily somebody whose prior focus has been on public policy. It could be on other kinds of policy or other kinds of translating research. So I just want you to be a little bit flexible in that so you don't miss out on a unicorn that you didn't know was there.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Geoff. Yeah, and I would also just add, Geoff, that, it sounds like the debate that you're having with Scott is, it's not necessarily an either or. I think that you don't need somebody who knows how to navigate the policy world. You just need somebody who understands that is important and that who can converse with your policy folks, right? Your policy folks have the skills already. Like you said, you have a deep bench policy-wise. You just need a researcher who can do the translation between the research and your policy folks. I really don't think it needs to be somebody who comes in with policy. They don't have to have the skills that your policy folks have. They just need to be able to speak that language and understand the importance of it. And they become that liaison or that translator between, the different folks in your, at your commission and also the legislature and whatever, right? They're the translator of the research.
I love the way you put it, Jenna, that it's, somebody who can speak that language. I think that's kind of what I'm aiming for, really. I think, somebody who can do that.
That's what, Jay Dixon was our state public defender for some years. He's in Massachusetts now, I think, with Daniel.
He's great.
Yeah, he is. And he used to say that what my job was to take a question in English and think about pull it apart into the little concepts and figure out where those concepts mapped onto data points. So Jonah's point about translating, very definitely in both directions though. They would ask me a question in English. I would find out the closest matching data points, fields that we had, then do the math, and then put it back into English to the policy people who would then go and make the pitch. So you, like Jonas said, teaching, I guess is what I want to say, teaching the results to somebody who can then go do the public speaking. So I think it would be hard pressed to find a terrific public speaker, persuasive orator who can also do lots and lots of math.
Right.
Yeah, people are kind of talking around this, so I maybe want to think of it as like a structurally systemy kind of way of thinking about it. What you need to be thinking about is what kind of work you need to be done that you can't do with the team that you already have. And so if you can, with the team you already have, talk to legislators, to boards, to whatever it might be, then the skill you're looking for in somebody else is how to inform those people on how to do that properly. So really focus in on what is the work that you feel like you just don't have the firepower for now, instead of what would be the perfect person to like outsource this to and restructure that. Just start from what's missing from our arsenal right now. And that's the advice I would give to anybody who's trying to create new positions. Instead of trying to think like what would revolutionize, why do we think in hiring with this like magical thinking of like we could find the perfect position that's going to solve all our problems. I'm saying I think this way too, and I have to remind myself, right? Actually, that doesn't work for any problem. You just have to think about what little things are missing, how to add them in, and then how to make that team more cohesive over time and maybe redistribute some of those. So people are kind of talking around that with this question of, someone who can do math versus public speaking or whatever. If you can take the budget you were going to spend on like a chief data person and split it into two people, one who's really, really good at math and one who's really, really good at talking, and make sure you hire people who are good at talking to each other, then, you actually will net much more benefit. Anyway, just different ways of thinking about it. I'm not even suggesting that as a solution, just anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Stephen. And one other thing I'll add is that, I do think that I have found in my position that public speaking is critical, and that we do have people, we have people who are far more qualified than I to talk to legislators. But there's something about saying, this is our research director, and he is here today to talk to you about research. Literally, I could give the same talk that I could hand off to somebody else in my agency. There's something about saying that to the legislature that seems to matter, or to other people. So I do think that having a researcher who has the capacity to be like a public face in some sense is useful. There's just, I don't know, it's actually ridiculous, but I think that, like, I've seen in my experience that there's actually something to it.
Can I ask a question related to that? I mean, there is, I think there is some weight to that, right? By saying, here's the researcher. And I mean, is there, and I ask this not just in terms of the weight of the degree, but also like maybe in terms of the experience of going through a program. What do you all think about PhD preferred, PhD required, master's degree is fine? Where do you all fall on that?
We definitely have a call, like you said, scheduled, and I can show you the presentation I gave at IDRA, but my opinion from everything you've just said is to lean masters, because in my opinion, I do have a lot of data points on this, but it is situational. PhDs, they have 6+ years of diving really deep into a topic and only talking to somebody on that topic. And so they get very used to that, and that's a great skill set for certain things. But it seems like master's degrees, it's a shorter time, and so you're more likely to have lots of experience talking to lots of different people and be more excited about those kind of projects, which seems like what you're asking for, like hands in different pots, being able to translate, being able to talk, and then that like storytelling aspect, which is what I'm hearing a lot from you, is like you want somebody to either back up your storytelling or find new stories to tell. Right. And again, that's like much shorter term project than what I see a PhD being excited about.
So I think that's true for a lot of master's degrees. The only thing I think because Leslie, you came from like science master's degrees, which are a little bit different than some policy and social science master's degrees. So that's the only thing, like the rigor of the data analysis for all master's degrees is not really the same in social sciences as it is for like I would say for a master, like if you find somebody who has a master's in a science program, perfect. Like, and they have an interest, like those two things would be awesome. It's just that like social sciences deal with masters sort of differently, in my opinion. And so you just have to ask more questions sort of if you want them to dig more into the data. But I think that just really is, in my opinion, so.
Yeah, I think there are two things you want to consider. One is your budget, frankly, because a PhD will cost a lot more. So I don't know what your budget is, but if you want a true data scientist, for example, in Massachusetts, one would get paid more than I do as the CIO for the public defenders. So we can't afford one. So that's one factor. And the other factor you want to look at is, once again, it's really not PhD versus master's. It's what are the skill types or skill sets you're looking for? Because those could be found in any one of them. And you know, I come from a hard sciences background. I did neuroscience research for over a decade. So I have very serious views on data analysis. But there are also social sciences. It depends on what you want to do from a social science perspective. Because, for example, the things they do, I never did, like surveys of large groups of people, you know, and analyzing that sort of data. And that sort of thing you want to do, those are the skill sets. So there are different parameters. So it's less master's versus PhD than what are the key skills you think that person will need. And you may want to put a baseline. It has to be a minimum of a master's. Even then, I'd say, you know, I know some bachelors who, through experience, gain some amazing skills. And so you may want to qualify that. So that's why I like to drive it through skills. And also, studies have shown if you want to get more diversity into hiring, you actually try to make the hiring based on more skill sets than pedigree and degrees, because those diverse candidates often will be less likely to have those things. So if that's consideration for you, you want to focus on the skill sets and less on the actual degrees. And I would say diversity is important, especially in this sort of role.
I see Cynthia Lee had a thought.
Yeah. Hey, building on what Meg and Daniel were saying, I would agree that you wouldn't want to necessarily specify whether you want a master's or a PhD. I would agree with Meg that a lot of the social science master's programs are not that quantitative. You can have a range of quantitative focus even within the same type of degree. Like there are some public policy programs that are really quantitative, and there are some that aren't. And then there are some that you can get through without knowing anything quantitative. And then another person can come out of that same program with, you know, basically the equivalent of a PhD in quantitative analysis. So it's really about the person. One thing that I have encountered with judges is that they like a PhD that's like a stamp of credibility with them, but that can be overcome with the person's expertise. Another thing is that I have found with indigent defense attorneys, they really like a dual degree to somebody who has a law degree, but also a PhD or a master's, who is kind of, they can see them, they think that the person understands the legal system. Again, all of those credibility hurdles can be overcome. And then to the point about credibility with the legislature, Jonah was saying it helps if you just, the researcher can say the exact same thing that the policy person says, and it's more credible to the legislature. Another thing you're gonna have with legislatures and judges is they don't wanna understand the math at all. They just want to know that the math is right. And so they will ask you things like, is this result statistically significant? When there's no way to calculate the statistical significance of that result. And you need somebody who can translate that, can answer that question, and who can kind of lend gravitas to the whole production so that your policymakers will understand you. Because often they don't really care about the math. They just want to feel comfortable that somebody did the math right.
Thank you, Cynthia. We're about 15 minutes from the end, and so I just want to check in with you, Geoff. What I feel has happened in the conversation so far is we've quite well covered your first two questions. You wanted first to know what should the lead researcher do. We've talked about agenda items and things like that, and then also what kind of person should we hire. And we'll have a recording of this call, incidentally, because there are just nuggets of gold everywhere about the kinds of skill sets you might be using, how you might be framing it, and so on and so forth. I want to check in with your third question is, as researchers, what kind of support would you want from an organization like TIDC, which I'm not sure we've covered as much, but I just want to put it back on you, Geoff, and say, this is a moment to pivot or to double back to something that you'd like to cover some more.
Thanks, and man, I can't believe we're 45 minutes into this already. This has been so helpful. One quick comment, just based on Cynthia's comments, and then maybe we pivot to that question about what would you want from TIDC if you're a researcher. I am, to what Cynthia and Meg were saying, I am a great example of somebody with a master's degree in social science, who basically at this point, 20 years after a master's degree, knows nothing about statistics. I stumbled through regression analysis and got a B or B plus or whatever, and I can read a report well enough, and it's helped me in that sense. But otherwise, I can't run any of that at this point. I have no idea. Yeah, I would love to hear from you all. I mean, one of the things that I asked Andy was like, we've talked a lot about what we want at TIDC and what we want this person to do and what the need is here. I want to think about it from the other perspective as well. You all are researchers. You're coming into a place like TIDC. What do you want? What are you looking to do? But also, what kind of environment are you looking to do it in? What kind of autonomy do you want, or what kind of direction or support do you want from TIDC?
I am sure that lots of people have thoughts on this, and I'm jumping because I definitely do. And I want to state this in the abstract because it's a very honestly sort of held opinion. I'm concerned that sometimes inside government agencies and also advocacy organizations of all kinds, researchers are second-tier employees, not top-tier employees. There's a sense in which they can fall into the role of kind of being technicians who are asked or called upon to serve the needs of the agency, which are, to survive and get funding, and secondarily to improve services to people. I mean, I'm being cynical deliberately, and I apologize for that. It's not really appropriate, but in a worst case scenario, this is where you can end up, right? You can end up with, what does the agency really need? Well, we really need our appropriation to stay as big as it was last year, and so the researcher is sort of deputized to do something that's clearly agency serving at that moment. One of the cures for that kind of problem, sidestepping for the moment the fact that concerns about your appropriation being cut may actually be perfectly reasonable, but I think one of the cures for the frustration that comes with that as a researcher is that you somehow feel like you're not maybe fulfilling your full professional purpose. You're not really using data to bring insight, going out there and discovering novel things. Instead, you're doing these slightly more workaday tasks. And to me, what it means is it's very important to have a researcher situated within the organization on the leadership team, and not as a kind of a second-class person in the hierarchy, but rather as somebody who's a sort of respected voice. Because when you're having these conversations about how shall we use data to talk to policy or something like that, I don't think it's desirable to have all the policy people get together and then go tell the researcher what to do. I think it's much more desirable to have the policy people, the researcher in the room, to have a creative conversation as equals, and that the solutions will always be better, and the meaningfulness of the work for the researcher will always be higher. And I would go back in relation to this to one of your first questions, which was, you'd like to have somebody there to talk about a research agenda. And the idea of giving somebody that as their portfolio is quite meaningful, I think, and having somebody who is empowered to at least think about that as part of their job, think about all of the different things that they would sort of like to know, and have that be their bailiwick, and have them sort of in charge of that, and not simply have the research agenda serve whatever the agency needs are, to the extent possible, the exigencies of working in policy. I would just give that piece of advice. Have them on your leadership team and a respected colleague.
That's very helpful. That's really helpful.
Sorry, I put my hand up, but I can just lower it. I just wanted to highlight something that was in the chat and also echo the importance of what Andy is saying. So in the chat, Jessica Tyler mentioned the research need to deal with messy or garbage data sets. And that is just, I'm a lawyer, not a researcher, right, by sort of training. And my degree is in physics and chemistry way back when. So my place is listening to other people talk about what's hard about their job. And I always hear like, well, I know how to clean up a data set, but these other people don't. And it's like very hard to have a research deal with another person who like doesn't pay attention to that stuff or understand that that's going to be part of the work. And it does make sense to think early about how that fits into the skill set. But, I've worked very closely with a colleague who I learned a lot from on this stuff, who on some days would be like in the zone, cleaning up data and being like, this is what I'm good at. I understand how to do this. This makes me happy. And then other days be sitting in rooms trying to get people to like listen to like the researcher asking the question, like, what are you even trying to accomplish here, right? And how is my analysis going to tell you if you're doing it or not if you can't tell me what you're trying to accomplish, right? And so that's really another piece of what Andy's talking about, is having him in the room as a trusted colleague, but also being aware that when a researcher says, what even is our goal? They're not saying what a lot of lawyers hear, which is, you don't even know your own goal. Why should I listen to you? What they're saying is, no, legitimately, please just help me understand how we would know if this is a success. What does success even look like, etc. That's not a challenge. That is a legitimate research question. And,
it's an invitation.
And not everybody hears it that way, is in my experience. So someone who can, everybody has to get used to having the researcher there, not just the researcher getting used to being there. Insofar as you're asking what would a researcher want to see culture-wise when they come to a job like this, that is for sure it.
It seems to piggyback in a way on what Andy was saying about it. Ideally, this is not like a command and control kind of relationship where it's like, researcher, go find this for us and come back. It is actually listening to the researcher and being able to say, why you actually need this data. What does it actually mean? And maybe that affects the way the research is done.
And I know that one of the questions you see it in the chat is, we want to know how well different initiatives are working, and being really honest about how you know if an initiative is working, because a researcher isn't going to be satisfied with, well, we have a lot of satisfied clients, right? So, okay, so how do you know that you do? And what is a lot, and if that's the goal, those are the hard questions you're going to get. But if the answer is we served a lot of clients, not a lot of that's a different question, right? So anyway, so a researcher is going to ask those questions in a way that's going to ask for precision that may not have been agreed upon at the beginning of some projects. So,
I definitely think it's a lot of give and take. Like for me personally, and I think this gets into a lot of the personality you'll see in interviews for sure. I really appreciate having Joanna's like big ideas that then I can run after. And when I'm running after those, I find like 7 more big ideas. And then I come back to her with those and she goes like, 5 of those are bonkers, go follow those 2. And that like, at least having a starting point from your leadership for me as a data person, and I don't have as much background in this, but I think even if you do, having the leaders point you in a direction and then that feedback back and forth is really great.
And I apologize, I've been so wrapped up in the conversation, I haven't had a chance to look through all the questions in the chat, Andy. I know there's a bunch in there.
There's several good conversations going on here, which are related to the things that have come in the conversation, I think. If anybody wants to, though, make one of their points verbally, there's a great time. So just stick up your hand or unmute.
And I'm going to try to, Andy, is it possible to get all the chat just copied and?
For sure.
Awesome. Good. I just don't want to miss anything.
I do think it merits discussion in the room. The point that Cynthia Lee just brought up is whether you expect research to be bringing in grant funding and what grants management resources will be available, and even what analysis you might expect the researcher to do of those kinds of grant funding things.
Sure.
That's usually like the structure of that data is always so different from, So.
Yeah, and none of our staff is grant funded. It's all based on funds that we get from the legislature. Cool. We have right now, just to give you all a sense, I mean, we've got 12 full-time employees. On paper, we've got 3 vacancies, and this would be filling one of those 3 vacancies. Our admin budget is about 3% of our overall budget, actually a little bit less than 3%. So we're a pretty slim organization. Most of our money goes out the door in the form of grants, right? One of the reasons we haven't done something like this in the past, part of it is, like I mentioned before, we partner with Texas A&M, but we also had an FTE cap at 11 employees that we got rid of last session, which opened things up for us and put us in a position where we could start to hire more people. We're administratively attached to the Office of Court Administration. We're part of their overall FTE cap, but we don't have our own little kind of FTE cap anymore. So we are in a good place, we think, to be able to hire 3 more people, and none of it's grant funded. It would all be straight money from the legislature.
I think what I hear in Cynthia's question, Geoff, is whether you would expect this person to pursue research grants to do projects from, for example, the federal government. And I know that there are a couple of aspects of that come to my mind, which I wonder if are on Cynthia's as well. Number one is just taking the time to actually write and apply for grants is actually a pretty big demand. They do take a while. There are huge advantages to getting them because they then allow you to embark on ambitious projects that you as a single person in the office probably couldn't have taken on. We certainly one at ILS in New York, but there are also, speaking from that experience, there are a couple of other challenges as a state agency, which is you're funded by legislative appropriation. So if you receive a research grant, is there actually a mechanism for you to receive the money, or do you need to work with a university and have their researchers be doing the work and acting as the throughput for the money or something like that? But yeah, I think what I hear in Cynthia's question is, do you intend for them to try and build a little empire for themselves, or would you encourage them to seek funding to go out and do, new and innovative projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we have done, we've gotten Burn JAG funding for some training programs and things like that before. So we have gotten federal funding in the door. And we have, partnered with other organizations that have gotten federal funding from the DOJ, from BJA grants and things like that. Primarily, I don't see that as what this person would be doing, I guess. I mean, we are a grant-making organization, and generally we have funding to give to other organizations to do the research. And I'm not saying I would say no to federal funding and that sort of thing, but I also know that just the application and also, gosh, the reporting for some of these DOJ grants is really time consuming. So I don't see that as the primary thing that this person would be doing. Maybe working with an outside organization that would be doing that and helping to facilitate it possibly, but I don't see it as the bulk of what they'd be doing.
The reason that I ask that is that I have run across a couple of states lately where their legislatures are encouraging the agencies that want to do a research project. They're saying, we're not going to fund you, go get some federal money. And so if that is, that totally depends on what your situation in Texas is. And that becomes very challenging for people who working in these organizations. Like I had somebody want to apply for an NIJ grant that was totally inappropriate for the project. So if that's the way your legislature is, you would need to have a pretty experienced grant writer and some grants management support for them, but it doesn't sound like that's the case for you.
No, I don't think so. I mean, and the grants, whatever we fund as far as research, with our money going out the door, I mean, ultimately all of that's approved by our board. And I think we on the staff side have a lot of input as to what happens with that. So again, I don't want to close off the possibility of federal funding for something, but I don't see it as a primary thing that we'd be doing.
Yeah. So we're just coming right up on the hour. I have found this conversation extremely invigorating. It's a topic that I find really interesting to talk about, but I've learned a great deal from all of you I have to say, and I am grateful to be able to say, that the Deason Center is supporting this event here today and hosting Hydra for this. So thank you to the Deason Center and to Joel and Crisp, their representative, who's here making sure that our microphones are under control. I want to give the last word to you, though, Geoff, I hope this has been successful for you.
I have several pages of notes, and I have not even cracked into what's in the chat box. So I'm looking forward to dissecting that as well. No, this is hugely helpful, and I appreciate all your all's time. Hopefully this summer we'll have some sense of when and if we'll be able to, again, I think there's a good chance, but when and if we'll be able to hire a researcher, and we'll definitely keep you all posted. But Idra, thank you so much. Andy and SMU, thank you. Appreciate it.
Could you share the job description when you have it done?
Yeah, we'll do. We'll do.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Adios, everybody.